Hello.
Our story begins with a much-needed prologue. The Age of the Republic ended with the rise of an imperial regime, led by Sith Lord Darth Sidious. Palpatine's rule over the Republic as Chancellor led to a very easy transition into his role as Emperor of the Galactic Empire. The Clone Wars claimed the lives of millions, if not billions, and the Jedi were wiped out by the execution of Order 66. Before the war even began, Sidious and his Dark Master, Plagueis, accidentally created a life. The name of that life was Galen Marek, but he wasn't discovered until 3 years before the Battle of Yavin. Galen became Starkiller, as Lord Sidious's first true apprentice since the fall of Tyrannus, in a duel involving Jedi Masters Obi-Wan Kenobi and Mace Windu on the Invisible Hand. Much had changed. The Jedi Order escaped into the galaxy with nearly 450 members following Order 66. They were responsible for establishing the Path and saving hundreds of thousands of Force users across the stars. As Sidious continued to hunt down Jedi, their numbers dwindled exponentially with the help of Starkiller and the Inquisitorius. Sidious's Inquisitor unit, led by the Pa'un Fallen Temple Guard Grand Inquisitor, was fully trained. They were trained because Sidious understood the importance of a functional group of marauders, as he referred to them loosely. The Age of Empire had been a success, and with Starkiller joining the Imperial ranks, those 450 Jedi, which had gained new members and allies over the years, started to dwindle. Their main force died off. Those who didn't become hermits or take brash vows were hunted down and defeated. Those with more experience and training attempted another assassination on the Emperor, but it failed terribly. Now, following the near destruction of the Jedi Order, the fledgling Rebel Alliance made a power play at the planet of Scarif. News of a superstation had been unveiled, forcing the rebels to act fast. They would lose their engagement, but the Death Star plans would find their way to Yavin 4. Master Obi-Wan Kenobi, a continuous supporter of the Alliance, was able to get the plans from Tatooine during a drop-off and return them to Yavin. The Tantive 4, which carried Bail Organa's adopted daughter, would be captured by Starkiller's destroyer. The Battle of Yavin, that would follow soon, would result in an Imperial victory, one that would scatter the remnants of the Rebel Alliance further out across the stars. However, even with their loss, there were rumors of growing frustrations inside the Empire itself. As Sidious cultivated the dark arts, like he and Plagueis had years before, he created another life. As the Senate was disbanded and the Imperial military tightened with the surviving Death Star, a new individual was brought into the galaxy across the stars, one meant to bring balance to the Force. The woman who gave birth was Shmi Skywalker's own daughter, a 27-year-old woman trapped within the slave trade out on Zygeria. The baby boy, named Anakin Skywalker, would spend the first few years of his life living within the capital city of Zygeria, facing down guards, working arduously to survive, and living off scraps. The warm sun of Zygeria was like a plague, but despite all the negativity, young Skywalker was able to find home in the mechanics world. He spent his time building protocol droids and small speeders, some of which helping other slaves escape. Anakin was born on the day the rebels were classified as defeated, 0 BBY. The year was now 9 ABY, and Anakin was with his mother. The two of them were eating out on the steps of their abode. It was a slave hovel, one for those not working in the mines. These slaves typically worked as house servants or shop workers, nothing too harsh by a slave standard. His own mother told him to always persevere. She was more aware of what was coming and what it meant for her. Nalia told Anakin that his purpose in life was far greater than what it was here, and he expressed that his only care in the galaxy was getting the two of them off this planet so that they could be free. Nalia told her son that his freedom was all she cared about. If he found peace, then she had peace. Her arm wrapped around him tightly as she told him that she loved him with all of her heart. Later that night, as she knew what was about to come, she woke her son up and rushed him to his speeder. A slave riot started, one with pikes, blasters, daggers, shanks, and anything else in between. The people were fighting back against the oppressive Zygerian regime, and as they did, Nalia got her son out of the hovel and down the streets. He wasn't awake enough to realize she wasn't on the speeder with him. When he tried to turn back for her, an explosion detonated the hovel, sending guards, slaves, and everyone else into a fiery abyss. Anakin wouldn't remember much for the rest of the night. Whether it was a cloudy vision from having just woken up, the tears, or the ash covering his face, he didn't see where he really went. All he knew is that when he woke up, a man was standing over him. It was a species he hadn't ever seen before. The sun was blocked out by the man's head, and his hand appeared over Anakin's body. Skywalker reluctantly took it as he was pulled off the ground. The man asked the boy if he was alright, and Anakin's fight or flight kicked in. So the Kel Dor man explained that his name was Dar Rekka. He was a former navigator for the Great Doran Society. He was out in the galaxy before the Clone Wars started, and afterwards he refused to return home. Dar explained that he did it to keep his people safe, but also to save those that would be affected by the rise of the Empire. He finished his sentiment explaining that he stopped here on the outskirts of Zygerria because there was a slave boy who had helped a couple dozen people get out of town, and those slaves referred to him as a special boy. However, they feared for him because of the coming riot. Dar came here to see if he could find this child, and asked if the boy in front of him knew about him. The Kel Dor man knew the kid's name, so he waited to see if this individual did as well. Anakin revealed his name by himself, and expressed that his speeder was built by spare parts in the garage he worked in. Anakin wasn't sure what to make of the man, but Dar explained that he would take Anakin to a safe place, if he wanted to come along. The Kel Dor turned his attention away from Anakin after giving him the choice, as he used his hollow binoculars to scan the area around him, just to see if there were any more slaves out and about. He didn't see any, but when he turned back, the boy was pushing his speeder towards the ship. Skywalker wasn't dumb. Living inside the city streets of Zygerria's capital had taught him a lot, but there was a lot more to learn. Dar Rekka would tell him stories on their way across the stars. Their next destination was a safe haven, and it had been since the second year after the rise of the Empire. As it turned out, Dar, after being a navigator, had become a mentor and a guide of sorts. His lessons consisted of history, the Force, the Jedi, and most important to him, the Barrando sages. He was of course once one of many sages that protected the people of Doran. Out here on the planet of Pabu, he was an elder, someone that the kids confided in for stories. There were a few Force sensitives out here, and Dar had himself an M-count reader, but he rarely used it. For Anakin, he'd make that exception. The two of them talked briefly inside the starship until they landed. Dar would greet the mayor of the town and tell him about Anakin, getting a chance to give the boy his own miniature residence inside the town. Pabu stayed off the map, and due to its isolation, those who were refugees were brought here. Some of the eldest members present on the planet were clones from a war long gone. Hunter, Wrecker, and Crosshair still called this island world home. Omega was one of the others who spent a lot of time on the planet, especially after the collapse of the rebellion. It was a story that'd be saved for Anakin later. At the current moment, Dar wanted Anakin to meet the other kids and adjust to a semi-normal life, because outside of their quiet little abode, the galaxy had changed drastically. Anakin would find home on Pabu, and he would be raised by 4 father figures, the most present of them being Dar, and actually Crosshair surprisingly. The whole slave upbringing thing spoke to Crosshair, and he wanted to make a positive impact on Anakin's life. But as the years went by, far more would change in the galaxy at large. The first 9 years, following Yavin, leading up to the slave revolt that led to Anakin finding himself at home on Pabu, would be grueling. The Rebel Alliance completely imploded in on itself. Brave fighters like General Syndulla would continue the fight, but their voices would be drowned out by the overextending power of the Imperial regime. Alderaan may have been destroyed, but the constant threat of the Death Star forced any and every uprising to cease to exist. In 4 ABY, the second Death Star would finish construction, and by 5 ABY, it would find itself in the field as well. The Emperor refused to continue his experiments with the Force and instead focused more on his eternal life. By the year 9 ABY, the year that Anakin found home on Pabu, Palpatine retreated into the unknown regions to continue his scientific work, and the rebellion itself had pretty much vanished. Hera Syndulla left the battlefront to raise her son, and this pretty much meant the end of the Alliance. The Imperial machine had more plans going forward, things that would ensure the rebellion never returned. These warships, starfighters, initiatives, troop variants, and so forth were the brainchild of Starkiller. He was a well-known Imperial official and widely supported by the Imperial machine. Even though the Emperor was the main power in the universe, his student upheld his role in his absence. As most of those within the Empire believed, Starkiller was the heir to the throne, the child of Palpatine. It wasn't the truth, but no one needed to know that. The following 11 years would be a rapid continuation of this. the Jedi would lose Hermit Yoda, and their numbers would dwindle down to 6 total survivors, these not including Ezra Bridger a galaxy away, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan held his surviving Jedi on a hidden world out past Kamino, due to its exclusiveness, while a new resistance was formed. Imperial opposition had run its course, and people stopped fearing the Death Star, because realistically, what was the Empire going to do? Kill everyone? Plus, as an incentive to their decision to fight, what was the purpose of living if they weren't living with purpose? These people were angry, but even with many more supporters in favor of this rebellion, there was no true leadership. The Alliance had Mon Mothma, Padme Amidala, and Bail Organa as organizers, but this new movement didn't have that. They had a number of Saw Gerrera-inspired guerrillas, but that didn't win over appeal from revolting citizens. The resistance was in limbo. This is where Omega came in, and eventually other freedom fighters like Kyle Katarn, Cal Kestis, and Hera Syndulla once again, as well as some other newer faces. Hera assumed the role of leadership due to her knowledge and understanding. Her son, Jason, looked just like his father, and he stuck by his mother's side almost all the time. The Empire, by the year 20 ABY, had their weapons of mass destruction. Starkiller continued to be a large threat, and Sidious had returned with a fully healed new body, showing and proving to his apprentice that the dark side was a pathway to many abilities. Galen was nearing his 60s, and he craved the age difference that his master now had, but he was willing to be patient. Sidious expressed numerous times that he would eventually teach Starkiller these methods. Whether or not he would was to be determined. With 2 Death Stars spread out across the galaxy, the Empire appeared overly prepared, its propaganda ever present, and now came time for the galaxy to rally around a voice and/or a movement. The Resistance was getting its fresh legs after General Syndulla convinced Mon Calamari General, Akbar, to join in their crusade. The Resistance struck at the planet of Eridu, Moff Tarkin's home world. They destroyed a shipyard and commenced a raid on the surface, one resulting in a rebel victory. The Resistance would retreat before Death Star 2 made an appearance over the surface, but no blasts would follow its arrival. Now that the combat was once again starting for the War of the Stars, Anakin Skywalker was a 20-year-old on Pabu. He rushed through the streets with excitement as he leapt down onto a rock formation that protruded from the island, his hand holding his lightsaber against his thigh, and his eyes focused on one direction. He flipped over a wall and rolled across the ground before stopping. His eyes looked over to his left, where he bowed before saluting to his teachers. They were all buried, but he loved them all very deeply. Hunter, Wrecker, and Crosshair had simply aged out. Crosshair lived the longest, and he taught Anakin the most, aside of course from the Master himself, the Keldor man who stood on the edge of the rock formation over the water. After saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to his clone instructors, he stopped at Dar Rekka's location. The Keldor's foot hung suspended in the air. Next to him, his staff planted in the ground, motionless, just like himself. Anakin was eager, but controlled. He just heard the news about the victory at Eridu, but he knew that Master Rekka would have some wise limerick about his desire to help. Yet, it did not come as quickly as he expected. So instead of pestering his instructor, he quieted his mind and lowered himself to the ground. It was a flat and even surface. His pistol and lightsaber were laid down next to him, and he lifted himself off the ground with just the strength of his pinkies. Anakin thought back to his experiences throughout his life, and what they meant, and why they all led to this moment right here. He remembered the grief he shared in after the death of his mother, Nalia. He thought about his first target practice with Crosshair, or lessons inside the local schools. His mind drifted to his friends, his first kiss, the heartbreak that followed, and the peace he found with his father figure, Dar. The two of them were inseparable, and without him, Anakin didn't know who he would be. Nalia was everything to Anakin, and he kept her close with a tattoo that covered his upper bicep and then moved across the backside of his shoulder. It was a floral design with different sayings that resonated with him. Anakin came back to the moment, and an hour had passed by. His eyes opened on Dar looking towards him. It was funny. The mask of his Keldor instructor hid his emotions, but Anakin could always sense what they were. Right now, Dar was smiling, despite it being very hard to see. The two of them stood up and bowed before they walked together. It wasn't a surprise to Dar that Anakin would be inspired to join the fight. He was genuinely impressed that Anakin had the patience to wait for an extra 2 years. But Anakin was, after all, like a son of his. They had seen the stars together, worked on spaceships as a duo, and saved hundreds if not thousands of sentients together. But Dar looked over towards the horizon. It was time for Anakin to take his first steps into a larger world. His journey here was complete, but it didn't mean that he wouldn't be supported. Dar expressed that his patience, training, dedication, and hard work had forged him for this. Their fight against the Inquisitor when Anakin was 17 was an indication of what Skywalker was capable of. Dar told Anakin that he never thought he could be more prideful in an individual, but here he was, totally blown away by what Skywalker had become. They started walking back to the town as he told him that the Resistance needed him, but even more, the Jedi needed new hope. As had been discussed, Dar Rekka believed in the Jedi way, but what he had taught Anakin was not a code-riddled understanding of the Force. Anakin was completely balanced and serene as a Force user, someone who understood the history, the light, and the dark. Anakin only operated within the light. All attachments to anger and rage were gone, non-existent. And so, Dar believed Anakin to be the founder of the new Jedi Order, the bringer of hope, and the one meant to restore balance to the galaxy. Anakin knew that his father figure held high aspirations for him, but even though these beliefs had long been instilled, the actual process of challenging the Empire, Starkiller, and Sidious was daunting. He believed in himself, and with his father's belief in him, he knew anything was possible. With all of that being said, Dar was gifting Anakin 2 instruments for his journey. The HWK-290 ship that had been in Dar's possession for years was to become Anakin's. Her name was the Shio, named after a type of bird Dar had seen on Kashyyyk. The second thing given to Anakin was a staff. Rekka had used the staff for years, mostly as a walking stick. Within it, he concealed a light weapon. It wasn't quite a lightsaber, but pretty damn close to being one. Anakin's held the same capability, but it wasn't needed to be used. However, it was blessed by the sages of Doran, thanks to Dar's connection to them. Anakin was the balance of Jedi ingenuity and combat, mixed expertly with the spirituality and expertise of the Barrando sages. He was what the galaxy needed, and Dar couldn't be more proud. He told his son where to find the Resistance, as he had been in close contact with one of their freedom fighters for a while, having freed her during an independent mission to Kessel. Dar told Anakin to go swiftly. The Force was his guide. He would see him once again at the sunset of the Vile Empire. Anakin and Dar hugged tightly, so tight that their bones could be heard cracking before they released, patting each other's shoulders and saying goodbye. The adventure was just beginning. Anakin watched his hands shake in the cockpit, both with anticipation, a little anxiety, and a ton of readiness. This was his chance to make a true difference in the galaxy. He would lift off and blast away towards the Resistance base at Rishi. The old clone base was retrofitted into a hidden location, and thanks to numerous caves, it provided ample room for the rebel vessels and encampments for their troopers. By this point, they had also kind of cleared out the worms that resided there. When Anakin first arrived, he was greeted by Captain Shriv Sergav, a Duras loyalist to General Syndulla's movement. The pacing at the rebel base reminded Anakin of his many missions across the stars with Dar. He expected it to be like this, but he fit in really rapidly. Shriv, Hera, and Akbar were all aware that Anakin was a Jedi, but he was forced to wait to meet with command until they were done with all their more important work and meetings. See, the rebels didn't take too kindly to Jedi. Hera did, but the Resistance movement as a whole felt abandoned by them, because of Master Kenobi. Once Bail, Padme, and Mon were killed off, he retreated, focusing on only the surviving Jedi, something he was still doing. Anakin was attempting to give the old order a new name, a new face to recognize, and a new motto. He was here to help and serve the Resistance as one of the freedom fighters, not as a leader or a general. He respected authority, and he understood that the chain of command did not run through him. He was an aide. Anakin, while he was waiting, struck up conversation with some of the freedom fighters, just getting a feel for where they were mentally. A lot of them were truthfully pretty mad. For many fighters, their parents served with the Alliance, and before or during Scarif, so they were fresh to the fight because of their parents, who were also a part of the Resistance. It was very clear that many people wanted to fight, but the Death Stars made everything feel impossible. They were dwarfed by the size of their enemy, one that seemed unconquerable. One of the individuals he ended up speaking to was named Sari Nuna. She was a freedom fighter from Ryloth, someone who, like Anakin, had seen the side effects of slavery. Sari was a part of a group of people that were chatting with Skywalker. Everyone had varied opinions on the Jedi returning to their fight, but this mostly came from worry that they would just abandon them again. Sari was one of the many people who felt this way towards Anakin, but he encouraged them to not be down on those who came before, for it was those who stood now that represented the ideals of what should have been. A lot of Dar's influence sat within Anakin. It was a weird introduction, but the young Jedi was eventually able to meet the commanders, where he was able to volunteer for a hit-and-run mission at an Imperial labor camp on Wabani. If they could break through, they could have a real chance at getting more freedom fighters. Anakin was ready, and he was assigned to the group of rebels led by Captain Shriv. They would make their mark and bail, giving the prisoners room to get to transports and dip. This was a volunteer mission only, especially after Iridu, but Command was grateful to see what the Jedi represented, joining them in combat. What no one knew was the presence of Inquisitors on Wabani. A couple of the silent killers were located on the planet because of prison riots. Due to the increase in hostilities from systems across the galaxy, the Empire was just snatching people and dispatching them to labor camps like Wabani or Nakina 5. These moves were meant to stop the rise of rebellion, but it just encouraged it where the engines were churning. The rebels were unaware of this uptick in Imperial defenses and prisoners. When they arrived, Anakin was able to use a sharpshooter to pick off a couple Imperial guards, located at different lookouts. Following these shots, the Resistance fighters broke into the main command center. All was fine until 3 Inquisitors pounced on the attack. Anakin had been running through this with a pistol, but ripped a purified lightsaber from his belt. It was white, but it had a blue haze to it. He told his rebel friends to finish the mission. As a reminder, these Inquisitors were fully trained and were fully capable of killing Jedi Masters. This would be a true test for young Skywalker. It was 6 blades versus 1, but he faced down these rancid opponents. Their blades collided and Anakin bounced around them, ducking and weaving, using all of his instructions and spars to his advantage. His eyes watched their moves, studying each hitch, finding every weakness. Anakin was a little shaky at first because he didn't have his father by his side, but he rallied quickly, jabbing his saber into their attacks. He slipped between them, sliding his weapon behind his back and slashing through one of their weapons, before using the Force to launch another from their feet. Anakin deflected another shot as he thrusted his hand forward, releasing yellow electricity at the Inquisitor. They flew backwards into a table as Anakin smiled to himself. The rebels inside the base took control over the generator room and security room. They were able to spot every Imperial across the base and identify weak spots, which were pretty much everywhere. Like on Narkina 5, the prisoners could be executed with the flip of a switch. Due to a lack of troops available to defend this territory, that was necessary. The Freedom Fighters got to work immediately, while also holding off incoming stormtroopers in a firefight in their corridor. Anakin could hear the blasters from his position, but he continued to fend off his opponents. He leapt over a strike for his legs, before slashing down and disarming, literally, an Inquisitor. With the Force flowing through him, and reaching a state of internal balance, he closed his eyes and allowed the Force to actually guide him. The Inquisitors used all their combined strength, the power that killed Jedi Masters before him, against Anakin. He slid back, planting and darting into the defenses. His weapon moved across the chamber, slashing through one of their bodies, jabbing into another before detaching the head of the final opponent. Anakin landed on the ground, rolling and then opening his eyes. He swept his saber and got to his feet, rushing down the corridor and taking point for his rebel fighters, who were planting themselves behind door hinges to heal their wounded. Anakin placed himself in the most imminent danger, but came out unscathed, as the Jedi were supposed to do. Those present on the mission with him would rave about him when they returned to the Rishi outpost. However, that was incomparable to the amount of people that would speak about their encounter with a true Jedi on Wabani. The captured personnel of the planet were forced to endure slave-like conditions, but it was through Skywalker that they saw both a Jedi for the first time and also truly understood what a Jedi was supposed to be. The Resistance fighters were of course mentioned, but the way that Anakin moved was unlike anything they had ever seen. Dar Rekka had trained Anakin to the most potential he could have at 20 years old. Anakin knew he still had much to learn, but he was floating at his full potential, just reaching to unlock the next phase of his understandings of the Force with his body and his spirit. Wabani, barely a week after Iridu, would dampen Imperial morale, but it also meant the crackdown of freedom for people across the galaxy. Those a part of planets that even had a single protester would be punished. This reaction did not warrant what the Empire hoped they would receive. After 40 years of Imperial occupation and fear-mongering, this was nothing. Sidious and Starkiller conditioned a society to breathe in fear. This wasn't a dormant people, it was a collection of citizens galaxy-wide that had seen Alderaan and Jedha, and they were not afraid. Life without purpose wasn't life worth living. They stood up to their oppressors, and the Resistance found what the Rebellion couldn't grab a hold of. Resistance leaders came to realize that the timing of their movement was necessary. The old Alliance didn't have a citizen force as amped up and ready as this, and the Resistance needed to capitalize off of it by finding victories and seizing the upper hand wherever they could. Following Wobani, Anakin would reach an almost mythic status, which is ironic because on a grand scale he really did nothing. But the people trapped on Wobani were from around the galaxy. His story was then told around the galaxy, and while it was just a Jedi stopping stormtroopers and maybe defending a few people from a number of turbo tanks, it was a remarkable feat. It was a folklore of sorts, something that resonated with every boy or girl, preteen or teen, and every man or woman. This was a true collective awe at the return of something sorely missed. Yet, as the Resistance reveled in their new hero, the Sith prepared a hasty counter, forcing Starkiller to once again forego a chance at getting himself a new and younger body. The Empire mobilized to drown out the hope of the Resistance. But, as was said before, Imperial troopers were spread out too thinly. Sure, they had their Resurgent-class Star Destroyers, and their upgraded TIE Fighters, and 2 Death Stars, and whatever else they could manufacture, but they barely had the necessary troopers to fill their ranks, to uphold the order they desired so desperately to maintain. The Empire was limping through tyranny, but they could establish a new order by executing this Jedi in front of the galaxy on Coruscant. Inside the Rishi outpost, Anakin was meditating. He was hyped up by the reaction, but he was also sticking to his true roots. Dar always told him to find the Force when he reached success. When he found defeat, trust always in the Force. When he was finished, Shriv thanked him for his hard work during their previous mission. He just smiled. Anakin was where he needed to be and where he wanted to be. Before he could return to his meditation, he decided to grab some food, and that's where he ran into Sari once more. She was clipped during the battle on Wobani, but like him, she was very eager for the next chance to take the fight to the Empire. He asked that she join him, where he was meditating, to eat, being that Anakin was still being swarmed by Resistance fighters. So it was a solid idea to get some privacy but also some quiet, because their initial conversation was intriguing enough for both parties to want to continue it. Anakin and Sari, from there, would continue to build a new friendship, one that would certify her as Anakin's true best friend within the Resistance. But the war had to continue. Eridu and Wobani would be kickstarters for the rebirth of a true movement against the Empire. As was mentioned before, there were many Saw Gerrera-like guerrillas that got curb-stomped by the Imperial regime over the years. This new movement was a legit movement, one that people could rally behind. Anakin's presence at Wobani made him a very necessary field commander, because Resistance needed someone that could stop Inquisitors. Dar Rekka would learn about his son from Pabu, and find great pride and joy in his son's accomplishments with the Rebellion. He believed this is where Anakin needed to be, and even considered finding his way into the fight to help guide potential young Jedi into following in Anakin's footsteps. Regardless, Skywalker would fight off another few Inquisitors, some dying, others escaping, in ground battles across the outer edge of the Mid-Rim territory. General Syndulla targeted locations with large garrisons of people willing to fight back, while Vice Admiral Holdo used her corvette and frigate fleet to pull Imperial fleets away from rebel movements. Holdo volunteered her lighter and faster vessels to challenge the might of the Imperial resurgence. These battleships were massive, larger than Imperial IIs, but they weren't much faster, and they didn't come equipped with gravity wells, so the Empire still needed their enhanced interdictors to actually trap rebel fleets. Holdo's maneuvers were brilliant plays. Some would result in larger combat with Akbar's fleet, but most were simply distraction moves. In some cases, they would have to destroy the interdictor to escape, but overall, it helped with Resistance morale. Due to the continually growing rebel force, the Resistance was forced to expand to more old Alliance bases. These included Dakar, Agen Kloss, Dantooine, Crate, and Hoth. Despite how spread out their cause was getting, it allowed the Resistance to use their hit-and-run tactics on more locations at the same time. but the issue was maintaining distance from Sith operatives. However, Anakin made sure their numbers decreased. The Marauders weren't a match for Skywalker, and Starkiller continued missing his first engagement with the young Jedi. Obi-Wan's surviving sect would continue to refuse to help, and it would perturb General Syndulla, because she fully believed that Kenobi was out in the galaxy hiding. But he was trying to ensure the Classic Order survived. Those with him believed in what he had to say regarding their order, and they stayed with him, in hiding. The 3 years after Wobani would see the Imperial regime start to buckle. The Resistance continued to win minor engagements, but no planetary or system victories came with their triumphs. The closest to a victory the Reliance got was the Empire pulling its forces away from a system so that they could reinforce another one. Part of the issue that faced the Empire was the fact that recruitment numbers dwindled after defeat of the Alliance. Sure, there were millions of annual recruits, but they were joining so they could get scholarships and do something they actually cared about. The military or the idea behind the Empire's strength wasn't present. The guerrillas encouraged an uptick in recruitment, but after Iridu and Wobani, it was nearly impossible for the Empire to actually gain new recruits. These two Imperial losses were seen as the tipping point for the galaxy. These recruits who joined for their basic necessities in life mutinied or sold out the Empire to the Resistance, which allowed them to get more momentum in coming battles. A big strategy for this movement was General Syndulla's avoidant attacks. She learned this from the failure of the rebellion, but if they could maintain victories without overwhelming losses or having propaganda depict them as losing, then they could maintain momentum. Everything the Resistance did was excel where the Alliance failed, and with the Jedi warrior fending off Inquisitors and eventually his first encounter with Starkiller, the Resistance had their own propaganda to promote. Anakin's duels with these Sith warriors would be paraded galaxy-wide. It was relatable to Ezra Bridger's message from Lothal to the galaxy, or Marva Karasi Andor's message from Ferrix to the galaxy. So, in the year 24 ABY, the Resistance was soaring high, after avoiding a deadly encounter with one of the Imperial Dreadnought variants over Biss. It was their deepest strike into Imperial territory, and it was nearly catastrophic. But it got what the Resistance wanted, the reaction of a Death Star. With one of the super weapons moving out to counter the rebels, they had the chance to strike a key blow to Imperial morale. The Empire tried to combat the rebels with their fighter forces, but it failed, due to strategies used by Syndulla and Akbar. The hit and runs were getting too unpredictable, and Sidious was going to try and return to his final resort. They'd been threatening the use of the Death Star on a multitude of planets, but they never did anything more than what was done to Jedha City. And even when a single reactor ignition was triggered, the Freedom Fighters didn't care. Not the Resistance, but the actual people, because they wanted their blood. And by the Force, they were going to have it, whether it meant life or not. It was something that put fear into the hearts of Imperial personnel. They were frequently unable to break the will of their enemies, which were just people. The collective people were rising up, and there weren't enough stormtroopers, enlisted forces, or forced labor that could stop them. The people, while the Resistance was striking across the galaxy, stopped working, grinding the Imperial system to a halt. Trade, resources, goods, and services were impossible to get their hands on. This directly impacted the core, raising prices as demand increased, but supply decreased. Inside of the rebel base on Dantooine, Anakin was joined by Commander Shriv and his partner Sari. Due to the way Anakin was raised, with lessons of the Jedi and Barando sages, he was completely willing to have a relationship openly. Sari and he fit well together, their personalities meshed, and they were both dedicated to the same path in life. Their desire to defeat the Empire made having a fully functional relationship nearly impossible. There was never any knowing of who would come back from the mission or not, and despite Anakin not being a practitioner of the old Jedi Code, he understood his responsibilities to the wider Resistance, which was the exact same thing for Sari. Their bond was strong, but aside from their bond, they couldn't focus on each other, leaving their dynamic as an almost open relationship, but they weren't looking for anyone else. Anakin as a warrior continued to grow exponentially. He was able to get his father to join him here on Dantooine, where they continued their lessons, but Dar Rekka never found himself on the front lines of battle. He resorted to a healer and a spiritual guide for those afraid or hopeless or even wounded. His presence moved mountains for the rebel fighters. With the Death Stars moving out to their selected locations, the Resistance had to make a plan of action. Anakin sat in on the debriefing where General Syndulla and Admiral Akbar suggested plans for these super weapons. While they were in the middle of a chat, they learned of another secret location on Ilum. It was called the Death Forge, essentially a third Death Star. It wasn't complete, but the Empire was establishing a weapon that didn't need hyperspace to be a threat. This left the Resistance with a tough decision. Luckily for them, reports showed that the Death Forge wasn't anywhere near completion. Anakin suggested something bold though. The Imperial war machine was reacting to the movements at BIS. They could use the secret hyperspace lanes to get into Coruscant airspace with a task force. They didn't understand why this would be useful, but as he explained, he believed that through an attack on Coruscant, they could breach the Imperial Dreadnought fleet and have enough weapons capable of challenging the Death Stars. These dreadnoughts had major cannons meant for bunker busting and destroying rival capital ships, but they were especially capable at destroying ground targets, like cities, towns, and whatnot. He proposed raids against these vessels, and then using astromechs or even some older droid variants to control these ships and use them in an assault against both Death Stars. Hera considered the idea and believed it to be the right one. They could use some of their light carriers once they knocked out the surface cannons on these ships. After all, if the fighters could destroy the dreadnought surface cannons, then they were completely defenseless against a raid with various corvettes. They could send the fighter fleet and Vice Admiral Hodo's corvette and frigate fleet as a joint operation to capture an entire dreadnought fleet. It was agreed upon, and they left for Coruscant. Instead of packing the defense lines with Imperial 2s, 3s, or Resurgent-class destroyers, the Coruscant defense fleet was lined with dreadnoughts. They were effective at long range, and they'd be perfect for detonating any fleet that came into Coruscant airspace. Not to mention, as Sidious was moving himself towards the second Death Star, Starkiller was sitting inside the lead dreadnought of the Coruscant fleet. His master wanted him at the core, waiting until his next orders, due to no one ever finding the location of a Resistance base. When the rebel fighters arrived, they sped down over the Imperial fleet. There were some support ships in the proximity of the dreadnoughts, but there was very little they could do to stop the faster and more maneuverable vessels. The Empire was prepared at Coruscant. They had interdictors and they had support ships, but these support ships would only be useful if the Alliance was coming in from a different direction, not from the secret hyperspace lane. Anakin flew in an X-Wing for this mission, helping his allies attack the surface cannons as TIE fighters rushed out of the various hangar bays to stop them. The rebel attack was extremely quick and deliberate, and due to the maneuverability of the rebel fighters, the X-Wings could break off and engage in dogfights with the much larger TIE fleet. As the surface cannons got destroyed, the Resistance frigate fleet arrived, with Vice Admiral Hodo directing her troop transports to various starships so they could begin capturing them. As she continued to maneuver her fleet to destroy the Imperial support ships, Anakin moved his X-Wing about the Dreadnought fleet, fending off the still incoming TIE fighters. He was doing this simply because no one knew if there were any Sith present inside any of the dreadnoughts. As it turned out, the fleet lead was housing a rival. Anakin sped down into the starship and exited his X-Wing, so that he could help the rebel fighters on the ground. The great thing about the struggling enlistment for the Empire was the fact that many of these ships only had a couple dozen guards, as most positions inside many ships were operating the bridge and the surface cannons. So without much protection, the thin line of stormtroopers relied heavily on sentry drones, ones that had proven to have faulty AI and struggle with combat. As Anakin rushed through the halls of the capital ship, he saw Starkiller again. The elder Sith apprentice slashed through various rebel fighters, who retreated past Anakin. His saber ignited and he rushed forward. Their blades connected in the middle of the corridor, as Skywalker told the others to break free and get to the bridge. He ducked his head away from Starkiller's strike. Anakin blasted his opponent's blade into the wall. Galen used 2 Sith blades and swung aggressively. He was fully trained by Sidious, and despite his training, their last encounter ended on a draw, due to the attack just being the destruction of an Imperial power station. Galen dragged his weapons across the ground and slashed aggressively at Anakin. He stepped back, parrying precisely, as he dove over one of the strikes, rolling across the ground and rising to his feet. Starkiller swung back, cutting down across Anakin's eye, but not damaging the actual eye itself. He stumbled, only seeing clearly from his untouched eye. The blinding light of the saber had done this to him, but he focused, not letting the panic settle. He moved his weapon into a reverse grip, as he challenged his aggressive opponent. Their blades connected again and again, forcing the two of them to interlock even more aggressively. Anakin was able to work more effectively with the lack of eyesight from the one eye, though it started to come back slowly. He slipped towards the wall, avoiding another few strikes, using the Force to shove Galen backwards. He threw his sabers into the ground to keep himself from slipping too far, before launching into the air and slamming down on Anakin. Skywalker continued to hold himself up, as he eventually grabbed a hold of Galen's wrist and twisted it. Without ever having lost a hand, he couldn't do much but use his physical strength against his much smaller opponent. Anakin smashed his saber down into Galen's hand, destroying one of the blades before spinning back around and slamming Galen into the wall. Anakin stepped away as Starkiller struck at him, but Skywalker wasn't finished. He threw his hand forward, pressing Galen through the wall, and Anakin lunged in after him, cutting through his robes and engaging again in a quick exchange of blows. Starkiller was using everything, and as he tried to use the Force against his younger opponent, he was beheaded, dropping to the ground lifelessly. By the time Anakin reached the bridge, they were already in hyperspace, with a full fleet of dreadnoughts. The plan was simple: activate their astromechs and control droids, prepare them with their instructions, and then they would abandon the dreadnoughts upon their arrival. What Anakin wasn't aware of was the fact that the Death Star they were coming up on was Palpatine's. It was a second super weapon, and it was preparing to detonate a planet to show the galaxy that the Empire had no problem sacrificing people for the greater good of Palpatine's rule. This mindset continued to force mutinies into Imperial ranks. It was a self-imploding regime, and despite everything Sidious did to maintain it, he couldn't stop what had already been set into motion. He would feel the death of his apprentice, and shortly after, he would look out from his throne to see a fleet of Imperial dreadnoughts drop out of hyperspace. The heavy cannons on every vessel were ready for combat, so the moment they deployed, the astromechs started firing. The rebels hopped into their starfighters and abandoned their stations. Admiral Holdo dispersed her fleet, not anticipating to run into the much larger super weapon. However, the dreadnought heavy cannons started to smash into the shields of the Death Star. With the astromechs controlling the reloading sequence, and the Death Star reacting by forcing all their troopers into battle positions, the rebels had a slight upper hand. Holdo's fleet remained out of the way, as they watched from afar. With 12 dreadnoughts in the fleet, and the droids firing rather rapidly, the Death Star took serious damage. The super weapon then tried to fire on the droids' ranks, but they started moving their vessels up and down, ensuring that one blast wouldn't destroy them all. The siege would last for about 20-odd minutes, and the dreadnoughts would lose 3 of their vessels, but the Death Star would be detonated. Ironically, not even because of the constant fire. It was due to the combination of a droid hitting the super cannon at the exact same moment it was firing. It created a chain reaction that destroyed the entire station, killing Sidious in the process. His clones on Exegol weren't ready for the next upgrade he wanted, and he never believed the Resistance would actually be a large enough threat to him. His initial plan was to transfer into Starkiller's body if the situation ever got too bad for him, but that guy was already dead, so he couldn't really survive. The attack on the second Death Star would be repeated with the first one, and it would result in the destruction of the other super weapon, but it would cost the rebels the rest of their dreadnought fleet, aside from the one that destroyed the station. It was kind of funny. The Resistance didn't actually realize what destroyed the second and first Death Star. They all collectively believed that the destruction came from constant firing, but it actually came from hitting the super cannon at the right time. Didn't matter though, both Death Stars were destroyed, leaving the Resistance with one more important target, Ilum, the location of the Death Forge. While the Resistance sped down towards yet another Imperial base, radical change was happening on Coruscant. The capture of the Dreadnought fleet, alongside the rapid collapse of 2 Death Stars, led to the rise of a complete and total uprising. The core itself was barely safe from itself, and the confirmed death of Starkiller and Palpatine, one of which at Anakin's hands, would be the needed fuel to turn the constantly burning fire into an inferno. Anakin Skywalker would accompany the Resistance on their assault at the Death Forge, where they would clobber Imperial defense towers and destroy the project before it could ever get off the ground. The planet of Ilum would survive, due to digging not being complete, but the Empire would never return to it. Following the rapid civil war of Coruscant, the destruction of the Death Stars and Palpatine's death would be the Great Imperial Mutiny. Many conscriptions were forced into place by a semi-stable Imperial military regime. Without Palpatine, the head of the Imperial Snake, the power structure started to slip away. His presence was incredibly important, because there were entire generations that only knew his leadership. He literally took the office of Chancellor 56 years before his death, not to mention the 43 years where he was the Emperor of the Galaxy. His presence was crucial for the continuous stability of the grander empire, and the extra 24 years following Yavin furthered the Empire's dependence on him, which is exactly how he designed it anyways. When he died, it wasn't like there were warlords who fought for power, because the few who still served hadn't had true power since the days of the Alliance. It was a completely demoralized military, and with mutinies by the hundreds of thousands, there was nothing the most loyal Imperial officer could do but just watch. The contingencies put in place by Palpatine were far worse than Operation Cinder, but by the time of his death, there were so few willing to carry out those orders that it didn't matter. The individuals who were turned on and killed by their subordinates. Anakin, on the other hand, after being a part of the crucial steps of bringing the galaxy back from its tyrannical state, stepped away from the Resistance. He wasn't foregoing his attachment to it, but the Resistance itself didn't need him. It needed to seize the day, bring back democracy, and establish a new government for the people, not its oligarchs. Skywalker knew that what he needed to do was continue his establishment of the Jedi Order, and instead of an actual Jedi Order, it would be a Jedi Order for anyone who had the capability to make a positive change in the wider galaxy, which simply translates to anyone with a heart to do good. He and his father would maintain their connection to the Resistance, but ironically, the whole purpose of this Resistance movement was to give the people a little push. Their presence was nothing more than give inspiration, and they did. Their work was recognized around the galaxy, and with Syndulla, Akbar, and Holdo paving the way, the future government would be set for true success, without surrendering its military or foregoing its commitment to the people of the galaxy. As Anakin left the Resistance fight, he would also have to leave behind Sari, not because they didn't want to be together, but life pulled them in different directions. Sari was given command over a select group of commandos, so they could free various slave groups from around the galaxy. Her movement was especially important to her, and she chose it because it called to her, just like the Jedi path called to Anakin. But this wouldn't be the end of their relationship with one another. Later down the line, they would reconnect, and from that there'd be the ignition of their bond, once more. It would result in marriage and a kid or two. But until then, Anakin would meet the dying Obi-Wan Kenobi, who had made it to his 80s. The Jedi were dying as a collective, and it was time for them to let go. But Kenobi refused. He maintained his belief that the code was necessary to the Jedi way. It would be here that Anakin realized that the concept of the Jedi were dead. But what that meant, what that could be, or how they could inspire would never be dead. It led to him deciding to create his own splinter group, one that mimicked the name of the New Republic. The new Jedi Order would be established, and he would scour the galaxy for people, not for relics. His purpose was set in stone, as he brought people from around the galaxy to a separate island on Pabu, and established the roots of this new order. There was history to be learned from the old order, but he specifically enforced the idealism of the present, and reminded those who joined him that above all else was their duty in service to each other. He would teach both the light and the dark, but this did not make a great Jedi Order. As he learned from his father, the darkness was corruption, but understanding it, feeling it, and not fearing what it could do was how one could conquer it. Anakin's lessons in the dark would challenge every new member, no matter how old or young, and it would allow their choice of the light to become even more understandable. As both Skywalker and his father understood, it was through understanding that curiosity is diminished. Because the darkness was accessible to those brought into his order, they did not chase its secrets or its mystery. Instead, it created Jedi who only focused on balance, maintained their attachments, and learned from past and present so that they could secure the most plentiful future for the galaxy and themselves. Dar Rekka would become the great elder of the Jedi Order, and being that he was a Keldor, he would live long past his son, but that was okay. He understood the burden that came with his age, and he would do right by Anakin. When Sari Nuna was reintroduced to Anakin's life, her Kalikori held an open spot for him, and he would be added to her family artifact as they joined together. It would be the first of many marriages held by the new Jedi Order, and their children would be the first of many more that would be raised within his coalition. Some of those who survived thanks to Obi-Wan would abandon the old path to join the new one, where rules and understandings could be established, but nothing would restrict a Jedi from doing what was necessary to best understand themselves so that they could help others. On Naboo, the new Jedi would find home, and it would also be the new Jedi that joined the New Republic for the Ceremony of Life on Coruscant, but celebrated across the galaxy. To replace Empire Day was the Ceremony of Life, and the galaxy would thrive under its remarkable gift. The government had a long way to go, but the Jedi vowed that they would never politically get involved, yet their commitment to the people would be funded by the government, and the Republic also established in their constitution a certification of the Jedi and Republic alliance, one that could never, ever be political, but always strive for a relationship that best represented and helped the people of the galaxy. Grand Anakin Skywalker would give to the Jedi the path necessary to build a sustainable and long-lasting Jedi Order. When he passed on, his children would go on to inspire many more, and his father, Great Elder Dar Rekka, would watch their growth with pride as he helped firm what the Jedi were and what the Jedi could be for the galaxy. And that, my friends, is our story. Special thanks to the patrons: Jonah Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Jack Silver, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Schmoobs, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Django Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Dark Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Grandaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Colin Rooney, Shark McDory, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo670, Anakin Snake Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Saints of Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calig, Youngly Slayer 66, Madman Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Photos Like the Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, The Man with Three First Names, Darkseid46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. First point of the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. Whoa, that's a long one. That's pretty cool. So, I guess the concept here is taking Anakin, just putting him in the actual late Rebellion era. I kind of went into this one with like, oh, him being born on Yavin kind of means that I have to change a lot. So there's a lot going on in this. And this is a very intense episode, but I really, this is a lot of fun for me. I got to do a lot of world building here, and I just had a ton of fun just creating a new world, adding to established lore, and kind of creating this new society that follows the Battle of Yavin. I kind of wanted you to come into this video with the idea that Yavin was going to be this triumph, but without Luke and without Hera and without Leia, I don't see the Resistance or the Alliance winning that. And so I think they would just crumble. I think they would lose, and I think that would be a crucial moment in galactic history. Also, having Starkiller as Anakin's kind of like little rival was a little fun to do. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Having the Kel Dor as like a father figure for Anakin was just tons of fun. So I hope you all enjoyed this story. This was one of the longer ones, but you know, I love you all. Spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.